All right, it's been several weeks since we've been able to cover our chapter 17, Jesus and Apologetics from Mind Your Faith. So very quickly, as Doy has been kind of taking us through the example of Jesus and the things that Jesus did and said to, as we talk about apologetics, to defend the truth, to offer up a defense, an answer for the questions that come up. And Jesus often, obviously, was involved in doing this. John chapter 5, I think, is a great example. It comes up routinely throughout the chapter in this book. John chapter 5, where Jesus appeals to 5 different sources as offering testimony or as sources for the things that he's saying and the things that he's doing and what he claimed to be. We noticed Matthew chapter 11 with disciples of John who came to Jesus. Are you the one that we're seeking? Do we seek another? Jesus showed them how that the lame are healed, the blind see, the dead are raised up again. All of that offers testimony and evidence to what Jesus claimed to be. Excuse me. Mark chapter 2, we talked about the man who was the paraplegic who was lowered into the house by his friends. So great was the faith not only of the paraplegic, but those friends in making sure he got to Jesus. And of course, in that situation, Jesus told him, "Your sins be forgiven you," which offered an entirely whole different element of teaching at that point, because it wasn't just the healing of physical infirmities, it was spiritual infirmities, showing his authority as God. And then in Matthew chapter 21, which was between Matthew 21 and then Matthew 22, are the last 2 passages we've looked at in relation to chapter 17. Matthew 21, where the chief priests and the elders are asking, by what authority are you doing these things? Jesus counters with his own question. He says, the baptism of John, was it from God or from men? Was it from heaven or from men? And they wouldn't answer. They refused to answer. They didn't really believe it was from God, but if they said it was from men, people were going to get upset at them. And so Jesus says, well, neither will I tell you what the source of my authority is from, because ultimately it was the same source. And then as we noticed in Matthew chapter 22, there's several different occasions throughout Matthew 22 where different groups come to challenge Jesus. You had the Sadducees who challenged Jesus about the resurrection, the question about the woman who had the 7 husbands who were all brothers and so forth. And Jesus counters all of them. But then, at the end of Matthew chapter 22, Jesus, instead of just constantly defending and constantly answering questions, Jesus posed questions himself. And in Matthew 22, at the end of, that should be verse 44 through 46, not 26. But Jesus, as he offers up this question in verse 42, he says, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" And they said, "The son of David." And Jesus responds by quoting what David himself says. They aren't wrong. Yes, it would be the son of David. It's not that Jesus was disagreeing with them. He would be of the lineage of David. But why is it then that David makes the statement, "The Lord said to my Lord"? There are 3 parties here. There's the Lord, David's Lord, and David. And so when Jesus offers this, who's being referred to? And of course, even the Pharisees, everybody understood that my Lord was the anointed one. That's the one of the Messiah. That was identified as a messianic prophecy. So when Jesus asks the question, if David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? And it's one of those issues where they didn't come asking Jesus this question. They weren't seeking to trap Jesus. Jesus went on the offense. He sought to try to get them to think, to get them to really dwell on what the Scriptures said about the Messiah. Because keep in mind, the Jews, their idea of the Messiah was a warrior king, yes, of the physical lineage of David, but who would reestablish the physical throne and kingdom of David and then fight against the Romans and kick them out of Israel, reestablish that kingdom. That was their idea. That was what the image they had of the Messiah was. And in verse 46, no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him anymore. Of course, as we mentioned earlier in Matthew 22, people kept coming trying to challenge him. And then here at the end, Jesus goes on the offensive. And it shows the wisdom of Jesus. It shows, obviously, the truth as it was taught in the Old Testament, in the prophecies, that yes, while it would be the son of David through by blood of lineage, there would be divine elements to it as well. It would be Emmanuel, God with us, and that this would be a spiritual kingdom being established, not a physical one. And so then, as Doy continues through this, he goes to Matthew chapter 23. And in Matthew chapter 23, it's mirrored in a couple other Gospels, but it's kind of the woe unto thee chapter. And we have different parties who Jesus is addressing all through Matthew 23, where he discusses the hypocrisy of the Pharisees in their outward show instead of sincerely serving God. Sometimes the positions held by critics of Jesus need to be exposed for what they are. If the views held by unbelievers are not tenable, it is certainly fair to point that out and show why. And I think that Matthew 23, and again the mirroring chapters in the other Gospels as well, Jesus, he's been constantly receiving these questions, people who've been challenging him, that going back to Matthew 22, Matthew chapter 21. And so as Jesus is addressing all of this, and he knows what the hearts of the Pharisees and the scribes are. And he starts out here in he talks about the fact that don't be as these are. He talks about the scribes and the Pharisees. They sit in Moses' seat. They're the ones who are the authority. They're giving the law. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe and do, but don't do as they do. Okay, you do what they say because they're the authorities, but don't do according to their works, for they say and do not do. And of course, we talk about that a lot, walking the walk, not just talking the talk. We actually have to practice what we preach. And that is the crux of the concept of hypocrisy. This is one of the reasons why so many people are turned off from organized religion, for instance, whether they become atheists or agnostic, or maybe they are spiritual but not religious, as sometimes the phrase goes. Is a lot of it is because of either perceived or actual hypocrisy on people that they think they're supposed to be Christians. These are people who are supposed to be doing what God says, and yet they're not. And that hypocrisy can be a huge stumbling block for other people. And so this is why Jesus says in verse 4, they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. Okay, they want the attention, they want the praise, they want the fame or glory that goes with that. They want the titles. But it has nothing to do with serving God, and it has everything to do with their status. That's what it's all about. But you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ. You are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Jesus isn't talking about fathers as in our literal physical fathers, but the sense of acknowledging that spiritual authority, that overarching authority. Verse 10, do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. Again, we refer to teachers as adjectives, not teacher, okay, as if it's some great and grand title. Reverend comes to mind. He who is greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus talks about the concept of humility which is directly opposite to what he's describing in the hearts of the Pharisees and the scribes and the elders of the people. Hypocrisy and humility, they're kind of antithesis of each other. They're the opposite. So this is why in verse 13, so notice verses 1 on through verse 12, Jesus is addressing the people. He's addressing the Jews in general. But then he addresses specifically these individuals that he's been talking about. He starts in verse 13, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." Now, what is he talking about when he says, you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men? And not only do you not go in, but you're preventing others from going in. What does he mean by that? Okay. So there's an example here where just the example, and it's not just the things that they teach, but what they do can have, obviously we talk a lot about our example to others in our communities, at our jobs, at school, whatever, and how that our example is going to either be positive or negative. There's no neutral, and we are always going to be setting an example. People are always watching, whether they realize it themselves or not. Certainly, whether or not we realize it, people are always watching. And so we're either constantly setting a good and proper example, or we're setting a bad example. And this is one of the things that the scribes and Pharisees, they're hypocrites in that they claim to serve God, to love God with all their heart, soul, and might. They claim to love their neighbor as themselves, but in fact, they don't. And so by their deeds and by their example, ultimately, they're not entering into the kingdom because they're not serving in sincerity. And then by their actions, they're teaching others that they don't have to serve God in sincerity either. Do as we do, because that's ultimately what people see. People see your actions. They hear your words, but your words don't mean much when your actions contradict those words. Yes, sir.
Think of the story of the Good Samaritan. You bring this up. And if I was the wounded guy, if I could have opened my eyes and saw the priest go by, I might have been excited that here's a man of God, he's going to help me.
Yeah.
And he went on the other side.
Yeah.
That's the same thing these Pharisees, scribes, and Pharisees are doing to people. If not making more just like them.
Right. Absolutely. And yet, here's this dirty Samaritan who was truly a neighbor. And Jesus taught that about what it means to love your neighbor, didn't he? That was the very issue. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus taught your neighbor is the one who needs mercy shown on them. And not even the Levite and the priest were willing to do that, even though you would think certainly they taught it because that's what the law taught, was to love your neighbor as yourself.
Another real-world example would be Doctrines in 3 John 9, which wouldn't allow people to enter into the church and cast people out who would try and receive the brethren.
Right, those who are... That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Diotrephes, he did not want the brethren receiving these teachers of the gospel, brethren who were traveling through, and he refused to take care of them. He didn't want anybody else taking care of them. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Anything else through that? Verse 14, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation." All right, first of all, is Jesus condemning long prayers? Well, what is Jesus saying? They're showboating. As a pretense, he says. But notice, you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. What does that mean? You devour widows' houses. They're taking advantage of people. Yeah. They're taking advantage of people. They are specifically taking from those who, remember, widows were kind of the lowest end of the status group in terms of being able to take care of themselves. They had to rely on everyone else. I mean, it's the lowest of the low who would scam or con artist their way to get stuff from people who can not take care of themselves. And Jesus says, for a pretense, you showboat. You make this long and these elaborate prayers and all these great sounding words, but it doesn't mean anything, and you take advantage of people. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Now, this is harsh. I mean, remember, he's talking to Jews who think they themselves are the children of Abraham. They are the children of God. They have a physical kingdom waiting to be established and kick Rome out. And Jesus is saying, you're a son of hell, and all the proselytes you make them twice a son of hell. But why is that? You travel land and sea to win one proselyte. How is it that they're twice a son of hell? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you can teach all the law all you want to. You can teach the prophecies. You can convert people and make them proselytes. That would be a non-Jew, a non-circumcised individual who chooses to be obedient to the old law, to be circumcised, and so forth. But then by your actions and the things that you teach, not just the things that they teach regarding the Messiah and their confusion about all that, but the things that they do, their example. Yeah, you taught them what the law says. They chose to obey the law of Moses, but now they're following your example. And you're teaching these people to do as you do. So it's not like you're really winning people at all. Woe to you, blind guides, verse 16, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he's obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Now he's describing this concept by which agreements are made. These oaths that are made. Swear by the temple, these oaths that are made according to may God be my witness. Okay, well that's one thing. But if you swear by the temple, that doesn't really mean anything. It's the value of the gold that is being put into the temple. That's what you swear by, because that's what has substance. That's what has value. Remember, the Pharisees were lovers of what? Money. They were lovers of money. They were lovers of wealth, of substance in the flesh, anyway. And Jesus is saying, okay, which is more important, the temple and the altar? Yet you putting more importance on the gold and the gift that is being placed on the altar as an offering to God, rather than those things that are actually making those things sanctified, which is the temple and the altar. Which demands obedience, which brings about more spiritual understanding and authority. Well, it's the temple and the altar, not the substance of the stuff that's in it. Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. He who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. So he talks about the authority of these oaths, and ironically, if they recognize the authority of those oaths and swearing to the temple and swearing according to God, God is my witness, you would think that those oaths would then have meaning. But since they're swearing by the gold of the temple and so forth, it doesn't really mean as much, which is the opposite of what they were really showing. But in verse 23, he talks about tithing of mint, anise, and cumin, these great spices, these wonderful things, expensive things. They offer their tithes. Was tithing commanded under the old law? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, they were supposed to tithe. But they put all of their attention and ultimately trying to draw attention from others on how much they were giving. Remember the poor widow lady who only gave, what was it, 2 mites or 3 mites or whatever, it was all she had? And yet here are these other people who were given great and large amounts to the temple treasury, and they're bragging about how much they're giving. And Jesus says, this poor old widow lady, she gave more than all the rest of you because she gave all she had. You can afford to give great amounts, and you're sitting there bragging about it. Yet she gave everything. Well, when Jesus says, you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the law. Okay, you focus on tithing, and of course they use that to draw attention to themselves, but they ignore justice, mercy, and faith. Now, does that mean justice, mercy, and faith is more important than obeying the law to tithe? Yeah, and this goes to show that is God ever going to put his people, is he ever going to make laws that in order to obey one law, I have to break another one? Is he ever going to put his people in that position? No. No. And that's a very important principle. I know it sounds kind of abstract, but there are many areas, both in the religious world and in hypothetical discussions, where people attempting to justify doing what they want to do, they say, well, yeah, I understand this is what God says, but in order to do this, I have to break something else that he says. So I have to kind of pick and choose which things to do and which things not to do, because you can't do it all. Well, the old law was very particular. Okay, perhaps, at least in details of sacrifices and so forth, more so, obviously, than the law of Christ. But notice Jesus says, these you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. It's not that the tithing doesn't matter. You're supposed to do all the law, but you ignored justice, mercy, and faith. You have to take all of it. And that's not what they were doing. They were taking the stuff that brought attention to them, not the stuff that actually had substance with regard to their soul. Blind guides who strain out a gnat, they nitpick the little things, but they end up swallowing a camel. Because they're ignoring these great, big, important, not that tithing wasn't important, but I can go through the motions, but if my heart isn't right, does it mean anything? If I sit here today during our worship service and I sing and I close my eyes, bow my head and pray along with the prayers, and I take the bread and the fruit of the vine, but my heart's not in it, does it mean anything? These great swelling words, these great offers up of praise, but if my heart isn't actually involved, I'm just going through the motions and it means nothing. And that's what Jesus' point is. It's not that what they were doing in tithing was wrong. They were doing their tithes fine. But they weren't taking the greater matters of the law, the sincerity and humility and service along with it. And so they were focusing on these little things, not to say they were unimportant things, but you're straining out a gnat, but you end up swallowing a camel. Because it doesn't mean anything. Your tithes mean nothing because your heart's not right. Yeah.
Normally we wouldn't swallow it.
No. You'd swallow a gnat.
Unless we're not even thinking about it.
Right.
Not even focused on that. Instead of focusing on everything
Right.
or
Yeah.
done something.
Yep. Anything through verse 24. Verse 25, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. Now, this is similar to what he says about the inside you're full of dead men's bones. Outside, it's like a beautiful sepulcher. Inside is full of dead men's bones. But when Jesus describes this, he says, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish. You go through the motions that purify you. Okay, you do the washings, you do the cleansings, you go through the motions. And that's what sets this a little bit apart from what Jesus is going to talk about with the graves or the tombs, and then the whitewashed tombs being inside full of dead men's bones. It's a little bit different because what Jesus is describing here is they're going through the motions of cleansing themselves according to the law, but what the law taught was always meant to be indicative not only of physical cleansing, but it was supposed to be representative of spiritual cleansing too. It wasn't just the motions. It wasn't just the actions themselves. It wasn't just offering up an offering on the altar. You had to have the understanding behind it, the reason behind it, the sincerity of serving God behind it for it to mean anything. And that's why Jesus brings this up. You take careful care to cleanse the outside of the cup and dish. You make it nice and pretty. Okay, you go through those motions, but inside you're full of extortion and self-indulgence. It doesn't mean anything because you simply go through the motions. So, verse 27 now. Again, Jesus isn't repeating himself. Now he's focusing on a different angle of it. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Now, think about what Jesus says here. He says, outwardly you're whitewashed tombs. Now, this is different, as I said, because what they're doing with Jesus talking about the cup and the dish, they were going through the motions of sanctification and cleansing and the obedience to the law and all that. Now, Jesus is describing how they present themselves to everybody else. They appear holy. They appear righteous. They appear like godly people. This is what Jesus talked about earlier in those first, 12 verses. They broaden their phylacteries. They widen their robes. They have scriptures all over them. And yet, what does Jesus say? Inside you're full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Dead men's bones or dead bodies in general under the law, what were they considered? Unclean. Defiled. And if you came into contact with those things, what did you have to do? You had to go through purification. Well, Jesus describes the fact that you are in a constant state of defilement. Your character, your soul is unclean. So you can whitewash the tomb all you want to. You can clean the cup and the dish and go through the routine of cleansing and purification all you want to, but you're still unclean. Thus, in fact, and a lot of times, Jesus, when he would teach, at least to the multitudes, a lot of times he wouldn't necessarily have to spell it out for them. He would leave it as it is, and they would understand or figure out parables and so forth, and the explanation would be made clear. But Jesus, he doesn't just leave it there. He goes on to explain exactly what he's talking about. Even so, you also, because he knew the Pharisees weren't going to understand it or were going to refuse to think about it, you outwardly appear righteous to men. You put on a great show to people, but inside, you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Now, I want you to think about that term, lawlessness. We've talked about that term lawlessness. Sometimes it's translated iniquity, but the term itself is that which is without law. Now, what's another way to say that? We've talked about this before from Matthew 7. If I don't have law, what else don't I have? I don't have authority. Yet the Pharisees, they claimed and prided themselves on following the law and following the authority of Moses. And yet Jesus says you're full of lawlessness. Without law, you are impure. Without the authority of God behind your conduct, you are unclean. And that's the point that Jesus makes. You say all the right things, you make everything look pretty, but in your conduct and in your heart, you don't have any sincerity or service to God that you're supposed to have. Thoughts or comments to verse 28?
I think in this passage you really see Jesus' status as a Old Testament prophet. We don't think of him that way, but this is exactly what Isaiah was telling the people in Isaiah 1. God's tired of their feasts and their Sabbaths, and you think they're doing everything right, but he says they're forgetting justice and mercy. He tells them instead, he says, to rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow.
Right.
Those are the weightier matters of the law. Those are more important.
And because it shows the heart.
Right.
It shows the service, as opposed to these things that I can do to draw people's attention that look holy, but I don't actually have to put any thought into it. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, the fact that Jesus, again, obviously Jesus is the giver of the new law, but Jesus talked and referred to the old law constantly. Because what law did Jesus live under? The old law. He lived under the old law. He was bound to the old law. And Jesus lived perfectly under the old law, so who better to give guidance as to how to serve under the old law? Anything else through verse 28? Jesus goes on to say, verse 29, as if all of what he said isn't enough, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. I think it's because Jesus is going to go on and talk about how, that's not true. But they say, you build the tombs of the prophets, you adorn the monuments of the righteous. You set up these memorials and these feasts and these recognitions of the faith of those who came before you. And then you say, if we'd lived in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have killed the prophets. You uplift the prophets and you uplift the righteous. Excuse me. But in the same breath, are they following what the prophets told them to do? Are they listening to the prophets? No. And that goes to show, as Jesus is going to say here, you would have done exactly the same thing your fathers did. Because you claim you love the prophets, you claim you hear the prophets, and outwardly you at least suggest that you honor the prophets and what they said, but you're not obeying them. Not the least of which was the fact of what the Messiah was truly going to be doing. Okay, the true nature of the Messiah, the true nature of the kingdom of God. Never mind that. Just the service and sincerity to God in and of itself. I mean, the prophets, they gave all. Think about all the things that Isaiah went through. Think about what Jeremiah went through, and Elijah and Elisha. I mean, there was terrible, terrible times they went through. And they were willing to give all in service to God. Jesus says, you talk a good game. But, therefore, verse 31, you are witnesses against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. What does Jesus mean when he says, you are witnesses against yourselves? What does he mean by that? Sorry? What you do is no different than your fathers. You claim, we wouldn't have done that to the prophets, but you're no different. You do exactly the same things your fathers did. And when someone comes and points that out to you now, what are they doing to Jesus? They're persecuting him. Okay, well, it's no different. It wouldn't matter. Now, if if Elisha came back, would they listen? It's the same thing. Oh, Jesus, come down off the cross. If you come down off the cross, we'll hear you. We'll listen to you. Do you really think they would have? No, they tried to stick him back up there again. Chain him this time. Verse 32, fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Jesus starts talking to them as if they're no different than their fathers, as if they are their fathers. When he says, you're witnesses against yourselves, he goes on to say, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Not that they can't escape the condemnation of hell. Obviously, if one were to repent and turn back in service to God, they could do that. But because they're following the same path as their fathers, barring any turning away, they can't escape. They can't escape the same ruin that their fathers and their grandfathers faced. Therefore, verse 34, I send you prophets. Who are going to be these people? Jesus says, all right, you want prophets? I'll send you prophets. I'll send you wise men. I'll send you scribes. Who are these people going to be? Apostles. Yeah, those filled with the Spirit to teach the gospel. Timothy, Titus, Barnabas. These individuals who are going to take the gospel, they're going to teach it to these same people. And what are they going to do with them? Some of them you're going to kill and crucify. Peter, for instance. Some of them you're going to scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth. The same end, the same judgment that came upon your fathers in the wandering in the wilderness of Israel, in taking away to captivity by Assyria of Israel, taking away into captivity of Judah by Babylon, and ultimately the spiritual judgment contained within that as well. The blood of righteous Abel, who himself, the Hebrew writer refers to the blood of Abel, to the blood of Zechariah. Now we're talking about prophets. In what way was Abel a prophet? What's the most basic definition of a prophet? Okay, mouth of God. It's not just one who prophesies. Okay, prophesying is a concept of saying, here's one aspect of prophesying, a miraculous part of it, is saying this is what's going to come in the future. But the most basic definition of a prophet is the mouth of God. Well, what did Abel teach? In what way was Abel like Zechariah and Isaiah and Elijah? Yeah. He offered a true and right sacrifice to God, and he did it with the right heart. This is in contrast to Cain, who apparently did not offer the correct sacrifice, and his works were evil, his heart was wrong. But by Abel's example, it wasn't just what Abel said. By Abel's example, Jesus puts him in the same category as Zechariah and all the other prophets. Have you ever thought about our example being a mouthpiece for God? Because this is one of the applications we gain from what Jesus shows. Because the very context is how the scribes and the Pharisees were hypocrites, because they say all the right things, but they do all the wrong things. Their example was the opposite of the prophets. Their example was just like their fathers. But Abel, his example, taught the truth. Zechariah, in word and in deed, taught the truth. And yet they were killed because they taught the truth. Verse 36, assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And so what does he go into in verse 37? Jerusalem. From verse 37 through the end of Matthew chapter 24, Jesus describes the destruction of Jerusalem. This is what he's saying, assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Just like judgment came upon your fathers in the wilderness, judgment came upon Israel being taken away to captivity, and Judah taken away into captivity, what's going to happen to this generation? You're going to pay for it too. And it's not just because Jesus says, because you're going to kill me. It's because you're going to kill the prophets I send you. And so judgment will come upon you. And it's the physical form of it is going to take the form of the destruction of Jerusalem. And as I said, from verse 37 here in chapter 23 through chapter 24, Jerusalem is laid waste. All right. We will stop there. We will finish chapter 17. This is the last scripture we wanted to cover in Matthew 23. So next week we will quickly finish chapter 17 and move on to chapter 18, dealing with Acts and what's it called? Apologetics and Acts. There we go, apologetics. Thank you.